Look closely at how you woke up this morning. Notice what your nervous system did within the first 4 seconds of consciousness. For months, maybe years, your baseline state has been high alert survival. The moment your eyes opened, your brain ran an immediate diagnostic. What is threatening me today? Who do I have to placate? What disaster am I managing? Your shoulders locked, your jaw tightened, and you prepared to absorb another day of impact. That is what psychological endurance looks like when you are deep inside a season that demanded every drop of your cognitive and emotional reserves. Here is the neurological reality. Human beings cannot distinguish between a prolonged psychological storm and an active physical threat. You have been running an internal engine at redline, adapting to chaotic variables, navigating betrayal, grief, exhaustion, or sustained financial and emotional pressure. You learn to live behind armor. You learn to make yourself small or make yourself hypervigilant just to survive the room you were in. Pay attention to what has begun happening over the last 2 to 3 weeks. The chaos around you might still look similar, but inside, something has broken pattern. You are no longer engaging in the same arguments. You are no longer frantically checking for validation from people who drain you. You feel a strange, flat stillness that you might confuse with numbness or apathy. It is not apathy. It is the sudden drop in cortisol that happens right before an organism realizes the threat has passed. Most people miss this transition entirely. They stay locked in combat posture long after the war has ended, destroying the peace they just earned. If you do not understand the subtle behavioral markers of an ending season, you will drag the trauma responses of your worst days straight into your next chapter. By the end of this breakdown, you will recognize the 5 exact psychological and behavioral signs that prove you are not falling apart. You are crossing the threshold out of the hardest stretch of your existence. Pay very close attention to sign number 3, because if you misread it, you risk restarting the cycle you just survived. Listen carefully. When people imagine a breakthrough, they picture cinematic climaxes. They expect a trumpet blast, a dramatic apology, a sudden windfall, or an explosive vindication where everyone who doubted them suddenly sees their worth. Human behavior does not work that way. Psychological evolution does not happen with a bang, it happens with a whisper. You do not leave your hardest season with a victory lap. You leave it quietly. You leave it on a random Tuesday when someone tries to provoke you into a familiar battle. And you look at them, feel absolutely zero surge of adrenaline, and simply walk away. That lack of reaction is the turning point. When your nervous system refuses to sponsor the chaos anymore, the season is officially over. The first indicator that you are stepping out of this crucible is the death of the urge to explain yourself. In the depths of hardship, an insecure or traumatized mind constantly over-communicates. You over-explain your boundaries. You draft mental essays justifying why you cannot attend an event, why you need rest, or why you made a specific decision. You are running an ongoing public relations campaign for your own survival. When the season ends, your internal dialogue shifts from defensive to factual. You stop writing paragraphs to explain a no. You stop carrying the emotional weight of other people's confusion. You realize that clear boundaries do not require emotional heat, and your silence becomes your strongest behavioral boundary. Look at your physical posture. For a prolonged period, your body has maintained what behavioral analysts call protective posturing. Shallow breathing, compressed diaphragm, guarded eye patterns, and an internal clock that rushes through every task as if an ambush is imminent. Watch what happens when the shift begins. Your respiration drops into your belly. You stop feeling the compulsion to fill every silence with nervous chatter. You sit in a room and allow space to exist around you without scanning for danger. Your autonomic nervous system is signaling that the immediate danger has collapsed into memory. You are no longer surviving in real time. You are recovering. During the storm, past pain is an open wound that triggers an immediate biological spike whenever it is remembered. As you cross this invisible line, those same memories lose their charge. You can look at the person who wronged you, the failure that crippled your confidence, or the loss that brought you to your knees, and the memory no longer induces an adrenaline surge. It becomes data. It becomes tactical history. When you can view your deepest distress as simple information rather than an active crisis, you have officially mastered the terrain. Do not attempt to sprint out of this season. When a diver ascends from deep water too rapidly, the change in pressure causes devastating internal damage. The same rule applies to psychological decompression. Allow yourself to sit in the quiet. Do not mistake peace for boredom, and do not invent new problems just to give your hypervigilant mind something familiar to fight. The heavy lifting is finished. The storm ran out of rain. Lower your armor, steady your pace, and step forward into the quiet control of your life. When human beings endure severe psychological strain, they build an unconscious expectation of how that pain will conclude. We are culturally conditioned to anticipate a distinct, cinematic rupture where the resolution is loud, obvious, and universally acknowledged. We wait for the moment the antagonist apologizes, the debt disappears overnight, or a sudden surge of euphoria announces that the crisis has passed. That expectation is a psychological trap. In actual human behavior, severe exhaustion and sustained adversity never resolve through an external explosion of triumph. They dissolve through a subtle internal recalibration of your biological and mental baseline. The shift begins at the physiological level long before your conscious mind realizes the environment is safe. When an organism is trapped in prolonged survival mode, the autonomic nervous system sets a high baseline for arousal. Your heart rate variability narrows, your cortisol output flattens at an elevated level, and your cognitive architecture narrows to focus exclusively on immediate threat detection. Every conversation, every financial hurdle, and every unexpected change is treated by your brain as an existential hazard. You develop an internal cadence characterized by constant acceleration, shallow breathing, and muscular tension around the neck, jaw, and eyes. As you step across the silent threshold, that hyper-aroused baseline begins to collapse downward. It does not drop with a feeling of overwhelming joy. It drops with a profound, almost jarring sense of neutrality. You wake up and notice the absence of an immediate adrenaline spike. You walk into an environment that used to trigger an immediate defensive posturing, and your shoulders remain level. The ambient noise of your own anxiety dials back by just a few decibels. Most people misinterpret this quiet reset. Because they have lived in an adrenaline-saturated state for so long, they interpret the sudden drop in neurochemical stimulation as emotional numbness, fatigue, or depression. It is none of those things. It is simply the baseline returning to an operational zero. This baseline recalibration directly alters your micro-behaviors. When you are deep inside the crucible, your behavioral responses are rapid, reactive, and driven by an urgency to protect your remaining energy. You interrupt people to defend your position. You scan rooms for judgment. You overcompensate with excessive politeness or aggressive withdrawal. When the season begins to quietly exit, those behavioral tics stop firing. You begin to pause before responding. When a minor crisis appears, you assess it through logic rather than immediate emotional panic. You no longer feel the biological compulsion to match the frantic tempo of everyone else in the room. The reason this exit occurs without fanfare is that real psychological evolution is subtractive, not additive. You do not gain an entirely new persona. You simply lose the unnecessary layers of defense you were forced to build to survive an unbearable environment. You drop the hypervigilance. You drop the internal dialogue that constantly rehearses past arguments or predicts future catastrophes. You stop treating peace as a temporary trap waiting to be sprung. The silence you are feeling is not an empty void. It is the reclaimed cognitive bandwidth that was previously consumed by the machinery of daily survival. It is the steady, unglamorous stabilization of a nervous system that has finally decided it is safe enough to put down its weapons. When an organism enters an environment of high volatility, betrayal, or chronic pressure, the brain deploys survival adaptations to keep it intact. If you spent the last several months or years walking on eggshells around volatile personalities, your brain developed the adaptation of hypervigilance. You learn to read the micro-expressions of people across the table. You learn to monitor vocal inflection, posture changes, and the exact cadence of incoming messages to predict an emotional storm before it landed. If you experience severe emotional or financial vulnerability, your system adapted through aggressive self-reliance, emotional isolation, or compulsive over-explanation. Every single one of these behaviors was an intelligent, necessary response to an active threat. Hypervigilance kept you from being blindsided. Isolation protected your drained cognitive reserves from predatory demands. Over-explaining was a preventative tactic designed to disarm hostile interpretations before they could turn into conflict. These patterns were not character flaws or mental deficits. They were protective tactical armor built to absorb high-impact trauma. The human nervous system is an exceptional adaptation engine, and it built precisely what was required to get you through the fire alive. The crisis occurs when the environment changes, but the behavior remains rigid. This is the survival adaptation trap. An armor plate is life-saving on a kinetic battlefield, but if you wear 60 pounds of steel into a quiet living room, it becomes an exhausting, restrictive cage. When a hard season ends, the immediate danger recedes, but your autonomic wiring continues to operate on the old combat protocols. You sit across from someone who genuinely cares about you, yet your eyes are still tracking their micro-movements for signs of impending deceit. You receive a standard neutral question at work, and your mind immediately drafts a 3-paragraph justification because your brain still expects an interrogation. This behavioral lag actively sabotages the peace you just earned. Hypervigilance in a safe environment turns into irrational paranoia and chronic anxiety. Protective isolation in a healing season turns into severe alienation and the destruction of healthy relationships. The reflex to over-explain turns simple operational boundaries into unnecessary negotiations, signaling insecurity and inviting boundary violations from people who sense your defensive posture. You find yourself fighting phantom enemies, exhausting your nervous system against threats that no longer exist in your immediate reality. Escaping this trap requires rigorous behavioral awareness. You have to recognize that your instincts are currently calibrated to a war zone that is now behind you. When you feel the biological urge to retreat, to scan a room for hidden hostility, or to launch into an unsolicited explanation of your choices, you must identify it for what it is, an outdated tactical loop. The behavior served its purpose, it completed its operational mission, and now it must be systematically retired. True psychological maturation is the deliberate dismantling of defenses that are no longer required to keep you safe. The human body is an analytical device far more sensitive than the conscious intellect. Long before your cognitive mind rationalizes that a threat has receded, your autonomic nervous system begins logging changes in environmental safety. In prolonged periods of psychological distress, the body adopts an unambiguous baseline of physical defense. The trapezius muscles lock upward to protect the carotid arteries. The masseter muscles in the jaw clench to brace for structural impact, and respiration shifts high into the thoracic cavity to ensure rapid oxygenated blood flow for fight or flight responses. You live in a chronic, low-grade physical bracing pattern that burns immense metabolic fuel. When a brutal season begins its quiet conclusion, the physical architecture is the first domain to break protocol. The transition is mechanical. You will notice an involuntary downward drop of the clavicles and shoulders away from the ears, signaling a reduction in sympathetic nervous system tone. The tongue releases from the roof of the mouth, and the constant tension held behind the ocular muscles begins to soften. Respiration naturally migrates down into the diaphragm, expanding the belly rather than raising the upper chest. These are not intentional relaxation exercises. They are direct autonomic indicators that the brain's threat detection circuitry is down-regulating its alert status. Observe the shifts in your behavioral kinetic pacing. In a state of chronic distress, an individual moves with an agitated, compressed urgency. Hand gestures are clipped and erratic. Eye saccades are rapid as the visual field constantly tracks peripheral movement. And speech patterns feature clipped cadences and elevated vocal pitch designed to minimize vulnerability. As safety takes hold, the physical tempo slows. Vocal tone drops an octave into a natural chest resonance because the vocal cords are no longer constricted by a heightened respiratory drive. Eye contact stabilizes, holding steady without the predatory intensity of hypervigilance or the submissive avoidance of chronic fatigue. This autonomic de-escalation directly affects internal neurochemistry. The prolonged flood of cortisol and catecholamines begins to recede, allowing the parasympathetic branch, specifically the ventral vagal complex, to restore regulatory control over heart rate variability and digestion. You stop experiencing the sudden visceral drops in the stomach when a phone rings or an unexpected notification appears. The chronic inflammatory response triggered by sustained psychological combat begins to subside, clearing brain fog and restoring genuine cognitive sharpness. Your physical frame stops functioning as a reinforced bunker and returns to functioning as an integrated, fluid instrument of deliberate intent. Recognizing these physical cues is critical because the mind often lags behind the biology. The conscious mind will attempt to drag you back into historical narratives of struggle, searching for familiar patterns of conflict simply because familiarity feels safe to an exhausted brain. By auditing your physical markers, checking the tension in your jaw, monitoring the depth of your breathing, and assessing the speed of your movements, you gain objective, real-time data on your true physiological state. The physical frame does not lie about its operational environment. When the autonomic bracing pattern dissolves, the battle is no longer active in the physical present. When you are trapped in a prolonged phase of interpersonal or operational crisis, setting a boundary feels like detonating an explosive. In an insecure, defensive psychological state, every no is weaponized. It comes loaded with emotional static, elevated heart rates, and a compulsive urge to construct an airtight case to defend your right to exist. You do not simply decline an invitation or terminate a toxic dynamic. You write multi-paragraph manifestos. You deliver preemptive apologies, supply excessive context, and brace yourself for the inevitable counterattack, because your nervous system still believes that displeasing another person carries lethal consequences. This high-conflict baseline is a product of an exhausted system attempting to manage other people's perceptions. When you live in survival mode, you operate under the illusion that you are responsible for mitigating the fallout of your own boundaries. You monitor the other person's facial expressions, decode their vocal tone, and spend days mentally litigating conversations that haven't happened yet. You allow yourself to be dragged into circular debates where bad faith actors interrogate your reasoning simply because your survival conditioning dictates that being misunderstood is an active threat to your safety. The definitive behavioral shift out of that hard season occurs when emotional heat completely detaches from your boundaries. You stop treating a personal boundary as an opening bid in a negotiation. It ceases to be an argument, an accusation, or an emotional performance, and becomes a simple operational statement of fact. You realize that clear, authoritative boundaries require zero theatrical anger, zero elevated volume, and zero defensive posture. In fact, adding emotional charge to a boundary signals weakness. It tells the observer that their reaction has the leverage to destabilize your internal equilibrium. When this phase solidifies, your language strips down to its bare structural components. You decline requests without manufacturing elaborate excuses. You step out of toxic dynamics without demanding a formal exit interview or waiting for the other party to validate your perspective. If someone attempts to bait you into an old cycle of justification, you observe their behavioral pattern without adopting their emotional state. You offer no counter-arguments, no frantic corrections, and no reactive energy. Your silence and absolute refusal to engage become the impenetrable wall. This quiet, conflict-free boundary architecture fundamentally reallocates your cognitive capital. Managing the emotional weather of unstable people consumes immense mental bandwidth. When you stop acting as the custodian of their feelings, that bandwidth returns directly to you. You no longer exit conversations feeling depleted, shaky, or desperate for external confirmation that you were in the right. You accept that people have the sovereign right to misunderstand you, mischaracterize you, or be disappointed by your decisions, and that their internal state has no operational bearing on your reality. The complete absence of the urge to defend your choices is the truest indicator of reclaimed authority. A secure nervous system does not shout, scramble, or seek permission to establish its parameters. It simply determines what is acceptable, communicates it with absolute economy, and enforces it through steady, non-reactive behavioral consequence. The modern narrative surrounding healing and personal breakthrough is fundamentally flawed because it equates progress with toxic, manic positivity. Society tells you that recovering from the most brutal phase of your life should look like relentless motivation, profound spiritual enlightenment, or an overwhelming emotional rebirth. That expectation sets a dangerous psychological trap. When people navigate an exhausting, high-threat season only to arrive at a state of absolute quiet, they assume something is broken. They search for a high that never arrives and mistake psychological stabilization for emotional deadness. Authentic psychological resolution does not feel like an explosion of joy. It feels like cold, objective neutrality. In behavioral analysis, neutrality represents the optimal functional state of the human mind. In a crisis, your internal processing operates entirely on extreme valence. Events are either immediate existential threats or desperate, fleeting lifelines. Every data point is heavily charged with fear, grievance, anxiety, or hope. This continuous emotional swings and roundabout state leaves zero cognitive room for genuine strategic thought. When you quietly exit that crucible, the emotional charge drains out of the data. You look at the financial setback, the failed relationship, the betrayal, or the years of wasted effort, and your nervous system no longer registers a spike. The event stops functioning as an active trauma trigger and converts into historical fact. It becomes tactical intelligence. You can review the exact sequence of events that brought you to your knees without feeling your pulse accelerate or your throat tighten. The emotional narrative falls away, leaving behind clean, actionable information that you can use to navigate the board with complete precision. This shift directly terminates the destructive cycle of chronic reactivity. When you exist in a neutral state, people lose the ability to leverage your emotional buttons. When an adversary attempts to bait you, or when an unexpected disruption strikes your schedule, the system no longer reflexively panics. You possess a critical cognitive pause between the external stimulus and your internal response. In that single calculated second of non-reaction, you retain total command of the environment. You stop wasting vital metabolic energy on manufactured outrage, useless resentment, or performative distress. Reclaiming that cognitive bandwidth is what allows true forward trajectory to begin. When your biological CPU is no longer dedicated to running threat mitigation scripts 24 hours a day, an immense volume of processing power suddenly unlocks. You can plan 3 moves ahead instead of surviving 1 minute at a time. You can focus on building sustainable infrastructure, acquiring new skills, and making calculated, high-leverage decisions without the frantic desperation that previously compromised your judgment. You move from the defensive posture of a hunted target to the deliberate posture of a tactical operator. Equilibrium is the ultimate weapon of human performance. It is the unshakable resting pulse that allows you to assess reality exactly as it exists, entirely free from the distortions of past pain or unrealistic fantasy. You are no longer intoxicated by fear, and you are no longer blinded by the need to prove your worth to an external audience. You simply see the ground beneath your feet, evaluate the variables with detached clarity, and execute your next action with steady, frictionless control.